a session of Dr. Rajesh Kumar Sharma, who is an essayist, critic, translator, and is currently working as a professor and head of the department in Punjab University, Patiala. Thank you, sir, for gracing the occasion. Topic for today's discussion is the past is not another country, recognizing and remapping the present through the signs from the other times. To speak of his academic achievements, Dr. Sharma joined Punjab University Patiala in the Department of English as a professor in 2009. He has a long teaching experience of 31 years. His specialization is in literary theory, criticism, translation, modern world poetry, modern European fiction, and film studies. He was a chairman of the Department of English, Punjabi University, Patiala from 2013 to 2016. Apart from membership of various university bodies, he has been visiting professor at Internal University, Badu Sahib also. He was an associate member of the Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, for 3 years. He was also a member of jury, Chandigarh Sahitya Academy. He was on critics panel of Chandigarh Literary Festival 2017. He is also a life member of Indo-American Center for International Studies, Hyderabad. He has authored 5 books and co-edited South Asian Symbol since 2009, a Canadian Indian literary journal. Most celebrated books of Dr. Sharma include N/Disciplines. These are the notes on culture, politics, and education. Blood Flowers, selected poetry of Harbhajan Singh Hundal. Kavita Da Sama, Maps of the Impossible, Moji Parinde, and his forthcoming book is on Aristotle's Poetics to be published this year by Copper Coin. Dr. Sharma has also translated Dharam Guru, the spiritual mentor, in English. He has been very ably guiding students of literature and research activities of the department for MA, MPhil, and PhD. Dr. Sharma has organized several national seminars and chaired this session in more than 30 national and international seminars and conferences. Dr. Sharma has been a recipient of UGC Major Research Project. His work has appeared in Brevity Film, Philosophy, The Book Review, Mainstream, and The Wire, and in various reputed academic journals and newspapers. His long innings in the department has turned him into a living legend of intellectual integrity and scholastic commitment. The students who post-graduated from Punjabi University campus bear a distinct stamp of the personality of Dr. Rajesh Sharma, particularly in the field of quality education on which he has never compromised and set an example of intellectual commitment in a world of crumbling ethicalities. What William Shakespeare has been to Stratford, Warwickshire, England, Charles Dickens to Portsmouth, Hampshire, Southeast England, T.S. Eliot to St. Louis, Missouri, United States, William Butler Yeats to Dublin, Ireland, is Dr. Rajesh Kumar Sharma to Patiala, Punjab. I have एक शेर है बच्चे जो सर मैं आपकी नजर करना चाहता हूं. हजारों साल नरगिस अपनी बेनूरी पे रोती है, बड़ी मुश्किल से होता है चमन में दीदावर पैदा. तो ये दीदावर राजेश कुमार सर आप थे, हैं और हमेशा रहेंगे. With these words, I would now request Dr. Rajesh Yes, sir, please. Yes, sir, please continue with the session, please.
Hello. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Manvinder Singh Anand has been embarrassingly generous. I'm sure that I'll not live up to what he has said today, and I'll happily fail. I'll talk about certain rather modest things, believing that, as I could see from the list, the audience is quite assorted, and people from English are very few, I think half a dozen. So I keep this in mind as I proceed further. My focus is going to be on two things. One is the legacy of intellectual traditions of India in terms of method, and second, in terms of the reflections on language. So I'll be speaking about method and language. The specific references broadly will be to Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Kashmiri Shaiva Tantra, and Kavya Mimamsa of Rajashekhar. The approach I adopt will be revisiting a few terms from the past that can illuminate the way we work as learners and teachers. This is something we all, I'm sure, share, that in order to be teachers, we have to remain learners. And the more you age as a teacher, the more you realize that you have a lot to learn yet. You know, when I crossed 50, it suddenly dawned on me that I had finally begun to understand how to read. And teaching is something that, you see, one keeps learning. So these are things I will request you to bear with me, to reflect on very simple things, but things which I believe are of great value to us as students and teachers. So this is from some reading I have made in the last few years, a kind of eclectic notes I made. So I'll begin with the 14th century text. You know, people in English literature know 14th century so well, thanks to Chaucer. This is by Madhvacharya, who composed a sort of encyclopedia of the Indian systems of philosophy, Sarvadarshan Sangraha. In his commentary on one of the schools of Indian philosophy, he says that there are 4 stages in the process of learning teaching, learning-teaching. The first is adhyayan, translatable as study. The second is bodh. Bodh is understanding, but it is actually understanding the way Heidegger understands it. That is standing under the object of your study, so that it kind of fills you with its light. The third is acharan, conduct, and the fourth is teaching, pracharan. Now, what intrigued me was that he had separated understanding from study, which made me realize that yes, actually, study and understanding do not always, rather do not often coincide. And this is the first error we make as learners. Having studied something, we believe we have understood it. Whereas as we proceed with reading and teaching and writing, we realize sometimes that after 20-25 years, we actually grasp something. So this is a distinction we have to understand, is to be made by the students whom we teach and the researchers we guide. That study and understanding do not necessarily coincide, and often they do not. And thirdly, understanding does not become automatically a part of us. It again takes a process of mellowing, of ripening inside us. So when he speaks of acharan, it is like you assimilate your understanding of what you have studied, and it becomes a part of your lived experience. and only then you are qualified to teach. You see, you will feel this when you meet like your most respected teachers. When I meet them like years, I realize that they don't need to study anything in order to be teaching us something of value. It is like their entire living has become an embodiment of light. It happens very naturally. Madhvacharya is giving you a whole system of grasping the long and arduous process of becoming a teacher. So when like I meet young teachers and they tell me, well, there are problems we are facing, problems of confidence, problems of like time management, I tell them that it takes years. Like me also, it has already taken more than 30 years. I have been teaching for 34 and after 3 years I'll be retiring. Okay, it is this difficult, provided you admit it. Well, this will sound like something fragmented, but my entire treatment of the subject is going to be fragments. And we'll try to put them together because, as I said, it is all about method and language. So I am in the first part dealing with method. Now you can already see that this is a pedagogic method that I have talked about. The second is taken out of Kashmiri Shaiva Tantra as a school of thought. There are three triads I have picked up to mention. One is of three terms: Prameya, Praman, and Pramata. Prameya we can translate as the object of the gaze, the object of meditation, the object of study. What we are looking at. Let's say we are trying to understand a text. That text is the Prameya. The second is Praman. Praman in Kashmiri Shaivism is the method of considering the object of study. So the text followed by how I read the text. Most of us remain restricted to a reflection on what we are studying. The higher level is studying how we study, how I look at something, how my eye meets the object I am contemplating to paint. And the third and the final out of the three is, he says, Pramata. When as subject we return to ourselves and treat ourselves as the object of study. So we begin with the thing being studied. The next level is we reflect on how we study, and the third is ourselves as the person who is studying. And you can see that when the three come together, this
Shrimanji, please switch off your mic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, so you see, the triangle begins to kind of rotate. So this is the dynamism that enters the process of thinking, of researching, of writing, of creating. The three at a certain stage begin to happen together. As I study something, I'm also studying myself. I'm also studying the way I study. So the three have to come together finally. The most immature stage is the first, obviously. And unfortunately, it remains the only stage for several among us unless we reflect on these things. The second is the triad of Ichha, Gyan, and Karma. You see, this is sometimes what people mean by the Trishul of Lord Shiva in philosophical terms. That one is the will, Ichha, the second is knowledge, and the third is action, Karma. Once again, you can see if we are looking at the process of creation, creation could be creation of a work of art, right? Creation of any theory, an idea. The first stirring is at the level of will. We will it, but that is not enough. And you can see that several people will something and then they end there. So after will is the consciousness of willing, the knowing of it. You know it. So from will, you move to the second level of knowledge. And the third is when having understood, having known, you begin to act upon what you know. So between will as the beginning and action of doing something is the knowing. Now, the three can also be seen in another way. And then the three are reversed. This is part of what you call Abhinav Gupta's great work, uh, Tantra, uh, Tantra Lok, which he summarized also as Tantra Sar into volumes. Now, there he gives us three methods of studying something. Of course, the context is tantric, but let's remove that context and turn to what we are trying to understand here, the method of doing our work. One is focusing on the activity, the thing we are doing. Now, in the tantric terminology, this is called the Anavik approach. Anavik, at the level of Anu, at the level of the individual, at the level of the thing, the object, the solitary object, the only aim of the study. We study the things, but at the second, we study the principles underlying the things and the relationships between things. You see, it is like Anavik moves to Shakt. Shakt is here the study of forces, the study of relationships, the study of processes. We can see already a movement from the specific individual to the general abstract. And the third is, and you see, this is clearly a distinction of levels also. Good research is necessarily beyond the thing and looking into the processes underlying what is manifest. The third is Bhairavi, that is of the level of the order of intuition. But intuition, as I see it at this stage at least, at this stage and at this age, as I see it, I don't want to see it necessarily as something occult or something mysterious. Intuition, I see as a kind of cultivated habit of the intellect, where you're able to catch an underlying truth without apparently going through the steps to arrive at it. But it doesn't mean that you don't pass through the processes. You don't cross the steps. You do, but you do it so quickly that it seems like light is dawning on. And I think several among you will bear me out. It happens when we are reading something, we are writing something, we are thinking something. Later, we build the steps, which initially we have like leaped over. Right. So these three steps are indicated by Abhinav Gupta. He was a great, theoretician of poetry, of the arts in general, and especially of the psychological aspect of the creative process. Then you have another triad, and this is interesting because we have a tendency to read terms from the Indian traditions as if they are translated from non-Indian traditions, especially those of us who have been educated almost from the beginning in English language. See, it is like this was a discovery to me when I read it like a few years back. I had no clear idea of how to distinguish between the supernatural and the spiritual. I always thought that it was like a kind of two territories maybe merging into one another, or maybe the two were synonyms. Until I found this distinction. This is about like the three aspects of human experience, including being human. And the terms are adhibhautik. Adhibhautik is that which denotes the body, the object, the materiality of something. The second is adhidevik. Adhidevik is what we can translate as supernatural. But the third is adhyatmic. Now, if the supernatural is a separate domain out of the three, then adhyatmic refers to what? Spiritual. But spiritual in the sense of the inward life of a person. You see, uh, this is something which I believe we all try to cultivate, the kind of inward life we are living. And we are rich or poor in terms of the inward life we have. Externally, people might be very, very wealthy, but sometimes we feel like not even pitying them, right? Not even laughing at them. And we feel that maybe we are richer even if we have no external wealth, right? So, adhyatmic does not mean supernatural in the Indian tradition. As I understand it, it actually means it refers to the inward life. Now, this takes us to a very important aspect to which the great essayist, thinker, critic, uh, cultural historian Susan Sontag was deeply committed. She disliked the whole project of postmodernism because she felt that she could have been wrong. She felt that postmodernism did not uh, take into account the element of the sacred in our experience. That there is something uh, that is simply irreplaceable in the human, and that is the dimension of the sacred. Now, we are reminded of what happened under the Nazis. We know what happens in the name of that kind of capitalism which treats human beings as mere resources. And for a very, very long time, India has had a ministry of education described as a ministry of human resource development. And we tend to forget that human resources actually came from fascist Germany, Nazi Germany, and it referred to human beings treated as raw materials for cement and raw materials for, you see, uh, fat, oil. Dead bodies could be treated as materials, and living bodies could be treated as like workers in the concentration camps and factories of the Nazis. Now, this is what happens when you forget history. You begin to respect terms which are actually disgraceful. When do we treat human beings as only data points? Harari has talked about dataism. When we convince ourselves that there is nothing essentially sacred about the human being. So it is like if I replace a brick with another, it's the same thing as killing a man and bringing somebody else in place of him, or getting rid of people I am uncomfortable with. Right. So transcendence is what actually this term adhyatmic leads us to. We might be similar in a certain way outwardly, but there is something within us in our inward life that nobody else possesses. And that is the reason each one of us is unique, and not only unique, but also to be loved and cherished. Right? Now, this transcendence, very interestingly, is indicated by a very simple word. We all hear it again and again: Tirth Yatra, Tirth, Tirth Sthal, Tirth Sthan. But Tirth, in Indian tradition, actually means the place where the stream has become so thin that the cattle can walk across. So it is a point of intersection. It is the point you make the journey into another realm, into another order of being. So Tirth Yatra is actually an attempt to transcend our given condition. Now, transcendence does not mean that we deny ourselves and become another. We become our promise. We become our possibility. We become our potentiality. Right? So, Tirth is this. And then another related term is Sandhi. You know, again in Kashmiri Shaivism, the practitioners talk about meditating on the point in your breathing where the outgoing breath meets the incoming breath, or vice versa. And they say that if you concentrate on that, you will realize that at a certain point, breathing stops. And then suddenly you realize that, well, there is a dimension to existence which we ignore. I found this in a biography of a great painter, Cézanne, written by Alex Duchaine. He said that Cézanne used to say that the only thing that matters is attentiveness. But attentiveness to what? He says where things meet. He says, I practice looking at, say, a tree, where the tree and the background of the tree are meeting, where space and cottage meet. And he says, I don't see any borders. He says, if you look at my paintings closely, and he's an impressionist, he says it's not just a technique, it is actually the case that you cannot determine exactly where the leaf ends and the space begins. They're interfused. Now, if you compare this observation of Cézanne with how Van Gogh's painting has been read by a very well-known art critic, I don't recall his name now. He says Van Gogh was very insecure, worried about the integrity of his self. So he says, what do you see? You see the outline drawn very harshly, very loudly. Even in his famous Sunflowers, you can see he draws a line which divides the background from the foreground, the object from the background, because he was trying to be secure in his self. Cézanne was not worried about that self. And Cézanne was a painter who waited 22 years for the first public exhibition of his paintings to be held. And he never compromised. It is said, though, that, well, Zola's great novel, The Masterpiece, was about Cézanne, and that they fell out. But this is a myth. If you read his biography, you discover that, well, they remained friends, and he knew that, well, it is partly about me, but so what? My friend has a freedom to write what he wants to write. Okay, so Sandhi. Now you can consider the stress very fashionable in the last 20-25 years on identities, on separations. But the fact is, The whole project of deconstruction is actually a project of the admission of the non-existence of clear borders. You see, why do I need boundaries and borders? Because they are not there. Because they are not as clear as I want them to be. So whether you will see Seema or you will see Sandhi, it is up to you. And it defines your ethics and your politics. Do you want to see how I am as a Hindu different from a Sikh or a Muslim? Or do you want to see where a Hindu and a Sikh are one? A Muslim and a Hindu are one. It is for me to make a choice. Right? And very beautifully, you see, this concept of Sandhi as an object of intellectual practice makes us see how, like, a novel becomes an essay, how an essay becomes a work of philosophy, how a poem is also prose, how a history is also a narrative, how Puran is both itihas and story. Now, whether we want to be Cezanne-like or Van Gogh-like, it is for us to decide. If we are insecure in our consciousness of ourselves, well, we can say we need borders, or we want to admit that we have actually so many points of contact. It is for us to respect and consider them. So the next thing I want to briefly touch upon is the idea of dharma. Dharma with reference to only one context, and that is in the Mahabharata. In Shanti Parv, when Bhishma Pitama is lying on his bed of arrows, and Yudhishthir comes to him, and Yudhishthir seeks his guidance on his duties and obligations as a king to be. Bhishma tells him something that remains of eternal value to all of us. And he says, and see, again, this is where I again was shaken into a new kind of recognition. I had thought that dharma is something that you have. जिसे मैं धारण करता हूं वो धर्म है. No, he says जो तुम्हें धारण करता है वह धर्म है. And what is that dharma? He says dharma is that which does not let you lapse from your humanity. How wonderful this is. Anything that stops you from becoming less than human is dharma. And that which prevents you from wreaking unnecessary violence against anything and anybody, that is dharma. And you see, this is being said at the end of the war. And being said by somebody who is the most respected of the families of Kauravas and Pandavas. Now, the next term is samadhi. You can see that some of these terms have become untouchable because people think, well, these are occult, these are of a certain religion. No. Fortunately or unfortunately in India, the practices of religions and the practices of living have always coalesced. And in the youngest of the religions in this subcontinent, Sikhism, I think this is most true. The way you live is what you have faith in as a Sikh. And the same goes for, I think, every system of belief, every faith on this subcontinent. That is, personally, I feel, what distinguishes us. Now, samadhi, this has two senses in two contexts. In terms of reflection and the creation of art, samadhi is that which Rajshekhar refers to in Kavya Mimamsa. He says, the poet cannot become a poet unless he can enter samadhi, and samadhi is when there is a perfect correspondence between the subject and the object. When the poet is able to become the sparrow that he is going to write about. The poet becomes the tree, the painter becomes the tree he is painting. That is samadhi. It is the immersion in the object, in the otherness of the object, so that the other reveals itself from inside. Obviously, this requires you to forget yourself. This is the poetic, artistic reading of Samadhi, right? In Indian poetics. The other, is immersion in what you are thinking of, you are studying. And this comes quite late in the stages of yoga, right? So you have dhyan, you have dharana, uh, you have earlier pratyahar, and finally you reach samadhi. And with samadhi also there are steps. You see the object from inside, and then you don't even see anything. It's like pure consciousness. Is it achievable? Is it achievable? This is one of the questions before philosophy. But in a certain way, it has been answered in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Well, this reminded me when I was thinking about this discussion, a term that is used by Anand Kumaraswamy, talking about the Buddhist and Hindu practices of art in the ancient times. You are writing something, suddenly forget to put a comma. Why? You have seen your draft so many times, but the comma is missing. You don't see it. Or you're writing something, you're painting something, you make an error. And it's a fundamental error. From where does it come? Kumaraswamy says it is the result of Shithil Samadhi. That is, there is a lapse of attention. You don't entirely enter the object of your study. So you make a mistake. Now, why these terms you see are so important to me personally as a teacher? These terms nail the problem for a student. Like somebody comes to me, he is not able to write lucid sentences. I tell them, well, you work very hard, but this is what your problem is, Shithil Samadhi. And they laugh and they understand. So pay attention. When you're reading something, become the thing that you're reading. Writing something, be 100% the writer, and there will be no lapse. Give your best. Okay. Now, why revisiting yoga is important for students and teachers, for me personally, for example, is for the kind of things it tells me. I was talking to a young colleague today in my office just before this, and the problem that my colleague shared with me was like she was not able to manage time, and that she was not able to restrain herself from being tempted to follow different kinds of things or different kind of readings and doing like single minded work on the object of her attention at a given point. Now, yoga, very simply, you see, the way it begins in Patanjali's case is he says, Chitta Vritti Nisheda. The mind has a habit of running away. To prevent it from running away, from fluctuating, from moving right and left, wandering off, this is what all yoga is. And I think that solves a lot of problems. How mind behaves, how it wanders is another thing that we need not go into. But he then tells us that, well, you need two things initially. One is abhyas and one is vairagya. Now, in my context, I see abhyas the way Rajshekhar explains it. He says it has two aspects. One, it is continual practice. Two, it is uninterrupted practice. You see, continual and uninterrupted practice is in itself a huge challenge for everybody. That is abhyas. Having done a first class MA and having produced a PhD thesis, we sometimes uh, are misled into believing, well, I know. But actually, if we ask ourselves, have we really done the abhyas we needed? We realize, well, not even 10% maybe, because it was one of the things we were doing. And imagine how much more we could have done had we been able to do continual, uninterrupted practice. Plus, he says vairagya. Vairagya is generally translated as dispassion. See, what you're doing. Initially, we tell like a young person, well, choose the area of study with which you are in love, with which you can live for years and years. But then there must come a time when you are no longer in love with what you are studying, that you develop a kind of distance from it, and yet you remain deeply committed to it. This is dispassion. Because unless you have dispassion, you cannot have a critical view of what you are studying. Hence, what happens? A lot of studies are one sided, right? Because we do not have the dispassion that is needed. You see, I am trying to read some terms from different texts for my own purposes. So you might feel that the integrity of a text is being violated. I don't care. The point is, if an ancient or medieval or modern text speaks me personally, answer some of my questions, why should I not do it? Provided I do not reduce it like some Princeton University publications are doing nowadays. It is like, you see, you read Cicero or Seneca and you try to find out how it will, reading Cicero will help you devise a modern business model. You read Cicero for reading Cicero, not for doing your business today. It might help you, but please learn to respect the difference of somebody coming from the past also. Then a term again that is tainted in the minds of many people is the Shraddha. Shraddha is one of the key components of Abhyas. Shraddha is actually deep faith in the pursuit you are making. If you don't have faith in what you're doing, you will not give your best to it. As simple as that. I remember I once had to tell a teacher publicly that I was ashamed that I had been a student. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you never walked into my class. You keep telling people I was a great teacher. You have been retired for 20 years. But let me tell you, you came to my class only twice in a whole year." And he ran away. See, because he did not believe in teaching. He wanted to believe in his own self created myth of being a great teacher, but he never taught. This happens. The same happens when we are writing something, when we are doing something, when we are painting or thinking or theorizing, whatever. Well, another interesting term, again, this is from yoga normally, is asana. In Tantra, asana is not the place on which you comfortably sit. Asana is where like your breathing becomes settled in such a way that it almost becomes you become insensible to your breathing. That is asana. It is the kind of, you see, deep ease you achieve with effort. Like after years and years of practice, you are able to say things you could never believe you would say earlier. Something very, very difficult becomes now spontaneous, right? It's almost a kind of intuition I mentioned earlier. So, asana is being at ease, which is an achieved ease, achieved through practice. Then, this is something we usually don't get to hear. I have referred to it in another lecture elsewhere, I think a few months ago, talking about Aristotle and Hegel and Abhinav Gupta. A key term in Kashmiri Shaiv Tantra is Swatantraya. The question is like, why does God create anything? God needs no reason, just his freedom. Now you can see, like when I started reading the Elizabethan literature, I was told, well, in a certain idea at the time, man was thought to be made in the image of God. And that man and that God is the man and God painted by somebody like Michelangelo. God is like man, man is like God. But actually, in Abhinav Gupta's case, what this means is that if God creates out of sheer freedom, I, as a reader, writer, interpreter, translator, create out of my freedom. This is how I am in the image of God. My freedom is absolute because the creator's freedom is absolute. Then you have a term that comes from, again, Indian arts, and it has been brought back into focus by Anand Kumaraswamy. Uh, Maybe in that book of his Transformation of Nature into Art. Antargya. This is very interesting. He says, where the Buddhist practice of art differs from most of the Western practices is that before you begin to make a statue, you have completed it inwardly. Everything you have visualized with last detail, color of the eyes, number of eyelashes, okay, then the arch of the eyebrows, hair, width of the forehead, angle of the forehead, glint in the eye. Having done this, you sit down and carve out the statue. Now, this is what you find in Mahabharata. When Mahabharata begins, a person comes and says, well, I have heard a story. I went there and somebody came and he told a story. So I'll tell a story I heard from somebody who told them a story in a satra, a place where people were sitting in the forest and exchanging notes. Now you see, it is said that Vyas had created the entire Mahabharata in his consciousness before he dictated it. How wonderful an idea this is. See, something like this I heard from the Punjabi painter Siddharth once. He was talking about how he learned making statues. He was initiated by lamas, and he says, my teacher made me sit and watch him work. And he said, I kept sitting. He said, don't move. And that day he said, I realized that it is so difficult not to move. You sit for 10 minutes without itching, without turning your neck, without moving your fingers. It's so difficult. But he said, after 2 years or 3 years, he told me, okay, now pick up that clay and make Buddha's head. I had never, beyond needing that clay, done anything of sculpture. And he said, I made a fairly excellent head. Why? Over those years, I had simply seen how it is done. So I had already done it in my consciousness, and I did it finally. So this is the, you see, ancient Indian idea of making art. The art that you make is actually being made for the second time. You have made it inwardly already. Those who have read Plato's theory would be reminded of something else. But now Plato will get another meaning. Like that things have already happened before they happen in the real world. They have happened in your inward life, in your consciousness. Right? So Antargya is the term Ananda Kumaraswamy uses. Antargya is that which is known or apprehended inwardly. And it may not even exist outwardly. This is where Virachana happens, poetic invention that Rajshekhar talks about. A poet can create something that never existed and never will exist, and yet it has its own truth. That is Virachana. That is the term he uses. Right? And he says such art is without any creator of that art. He uses a word, ayoni, art which is not born of any source. The only source is the poet's imagination. Okay. Before we move to Buddhi, language, we come to the final term in the first part of method, that is Buddhi. Buddhi, you know, is a term that is distinct from man. You have three parts of Buddhi, and those three are Mati, Smriti, and Pragya. And this throws a lot of light on how to think about thinking. Smriti, you know, is memory. Mati is the part of decision-making consciousness. Buddhi is that which decides between right and wrong, good and bad, good and better, etc., etc. So mati is that which takes into account what is now happening around you. And the third is pragya. Pragya is that which can catch what is invisible, which can visualize the invisible, which can see the light inside things, which can catch the possibilities. And if buddhi has these three parts, then you can understand how memory and the consciousness of the present and a certain awareness of what meanings lie kind of lurking behind appearances, how the three together operate to direct your attention to the things you want to do. See, these are things which help me, for example, understand how I work and where my problems come and how to sort out those problems. So we move to language now. Uh, how important is language? See, there is no doubt about this that the Indian Shastra tradition places language at a very high pedestal. Not because the word is God, no. Rather, it is said that, well, Vyakaran, for example, Panini describes Vyakaran as a Shabd Anushasan. But Anushasan is not discipline necessarily. It has so many meanings in the Indian tradition. It could be a compilation, it could be a discipline in the sense of a subject, a domain. It could also be an arrangement, it could be a structure, it could be a study, right? But remember, he says Vyakaran is born after the indistinct sea of noises has been faced, and there's a story in mythology of Indra finally breaking up the sounds apart and giving them distinct identities. And so language is born. And Vyakaran is that which creates that system of differences. Remember your socio, right? That creates a system of differences, distinct identities. Then Vyakaran is a Vedang and the preeminent Vedang, the part of the study of the Vedas without which the Vedas cannot be studied. So much so that in Dhammapada, and Dhammapada is ascribed to Gautam Buddha, Buddha says that he who knows words, their use, and their arrangement in sentences can directly apprehend the truth. This is Gautam Buddha saying. So those of us who are wedded to words, we have actually a very high vocation given to us, I feel. You see, this is Dhammapad, and Mahabharata describes the study of language as the royal road to the highest truth. Now think about this. If consciousness is something that we experience consciously only through language, and here Abhinav Gupta is like treading a very unique, different course. We have been like told that, well, according to Laka, language is part of the symbolic, and symbolic is something that happens quite late in the growth of the infant. There, Bhartrihari speaks of a certain proto-language that is already there before the child begins learning a language. That is, you cannot think, he says, without a certain kind of system of signs. It is already there. So it is part of your coming up as a human being before you pick up any words, any sounds. So now you can see, if consciousness can be experienced as consciousness as only through language, then language must be the only way to arrive at truth. Now, this is also part of a tradition about which people have an erroneous view that, well, truth is something very, very fuzzy. It comes directly. You don't have to think it. You do not have any words for it. No. Here are the Shastras telling us, well, language is the route to truth. so simply and so clearly stated. Then, all verbal discourse. I'm now moving almost entirely to Rajshekhar. Rajshekhar wrote some 1000 years ago, somewhere in the 10th, 11th centuries AD. And his wife was a great poet and critic, so much so that he cites her to support his arguments. This is wonderful. Now, Rajshekhar, his 18-volume study, we have only one volume of it. And you can see what is the scope of that single volume. Even that is fragmentary, the way it is available to us. Now, he describes the entire verbal discourse as comprising two parts. One is Kavya, another is Shastra. Right. And he defines each. Shastra, he says, is Vicharit Sustha. That which has been thought, definitively settled, clearly laid out, understood. Kavya is, he says, Avicharita Ramaniya. Now, Ramaniya has one connotation of pleasant, but another of a certain kind of wandering, of tentativeness, of freedom of movement. Avicharit does not mean thoughtless. Avicharit is at the edge of thinking, trying to probe those areas of experience or non-experience which just suggest themselves on the horizon of our consciousness. Poetry deals with that. But he says there can be no serious poetry without Shastra. If you do not deal with settled knowledge, clear, lucid knowledge, unambiguous understanding, your poetry cannot have depth and gravity. So, Shastra will include all those disciplines: metallurgy, archaeology, architecture, weapon making. A poet is expected to have interdisciplinary training and skills before he can even begin to think of himself as marked out to write poetry in future. The poetry is not somebody who has his hands in his pockets and just keeps roaming and singing poetry. No, he lives life right on the ground. Right. Now, what kind of learners are there? This is very, pardon, yeah?
Rajesh, sir, I just want to say that it is the time for discussions and the deliberations. The last
I'll
30
take
minutes.
4 minutes, right? Give me 4 minutes.
Sure, sir. For sure.
Right.
Please continue. Please.
Now, because this is something that touches again all of us and a little comically. One is it describes the kinds of learner we have. One is Buddhiman, another is Ahare Buddhi, and the third is Durbuddhi. Durbuddhi is a learner whom you can teach anything, he'll never learn. Ahare Buddhi is somebody who can be trained to think, to learn. He can receive and imbibe. And Buddhiman is one who already has those capabilities. That already means what kind of skills? He has a desire to learn, he can understand, he can raise questions, and he can find solutions, and he can make new things. He's Buddhiman. And of poets, you can see now what kind of researchers we are. The worst is Achhadak. Poets भी ऐसे होते हैं. You pick up somebody's poem and you sell it off as your own. You conceal the original and you sell it off as somebody else, as your own. Right? They are concealers. Then there are sangrahaks who compile data, put it together and say, well, this is an original research. Third is Parivartak, who transform what is given. And the only one worthy of respect is Utpadak, who actually produces original knowledge. How simple, but how current. Then critics. Now, critics obviously include thinkers also. Because for him, the word for critic is not chintak. The word for critic is bhavak. One who can be, जो भावना कर सकता है, who can be what he thinks, what he reads, what he studies. One kind of critic is arochiki, indifferent. Another is, this is a bit difficult word. It is satrin bhyavahari, one who eats straw, gadha. Some critics are like straw eating. Another is matsari, one who is motivated by jealousy. He will never find anything good about your work. He'll simply find faults. And the last one is tattva abhiniveshi, one who can reach the essential in your work. You tell me, don't you have a whole system of describing critics, right? So uh, I'll mention two words finally. One is pratibha. Pratibha is a word that has been again vulgarized in the minds of most people. Pratibha, they believe, is talent because we tend to read Pratibha via talent. Pratibha actually is a kind of inner light that you have created in yourself through work, which throws light on the object of study and makes it reveals its innermost secrets. So prati abha, it is what reveals the light in the thing because it is a light coming from inside yourself. Okay. Now, this is one term, and another is vyutpatti, bahugyata. The writer, the poet is supposed to be a person of multiple knowledges so that he can make a distinction between what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. These are preconditions for anybody who picks up the pen or who begins to teach. All right. And I'll end with again language where he says, words dwell in three places simultaneously. One is Kant, another is head, the intellect, and the third is Hriday. And this is, you see, a wonderful integral idea of how to look at language. Unless language speaks from the heart and to the heart, involves the intellect, and is heard in your ears, like Flaubert used to test language in this way. Whatever you write, whatever you read, whatever you think is not completely carried across. Right? So thank you so much. Thank you. Now I take any
Thank,
questions. I hope
thank
I
you
did not
so much,
disappoint
sir.
you much.
No, sir. Thank you, sir, for delivering
Thank you.
such an
Thank you.
illuminating lecture. Now the
Thank
house
you,
is
sir.
open for the discussions, interpretation, and deliberations. Yes, anybody.
Dr. Maninder, please
Do I?
switch off your mic. Yeah. Sir, can I ask a question if you allow? Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for this lecture. You said it's fragmented, but I actually thought it's not fragmented at all. Sir, I want to ask you a question. You spoke about intuition as very different from how it is normally perceived. You said it's a kind of cultivated ability over a period of time. And just now when you closed, you spoke about pratibha also as a cultivated ability. So do you think that pratibha and intuition somewhere are interrelated, therefore, and one leads to another?
Yes, you see, one of the types of pratibha that Rajshekhar mentions is inborn. Right. So that he says some poets are saraswat, like they're born with the gift of poetry. Others will learn it, and others will just like manage to produce poetry without learning anything, like formulaic poets. But you see, as far as the theme of this refresher course is concerned, within that, I think we have to reflect on these concepts from tradition in terms of doable things. And I believe Pratibha, if we believe that it is something that descends from the heavens, right, or intuition is something that is descending from the heavens, I don't think that is the case because that is an insult to the artist and the writer and the thinker. They spend, you see, their whole life building up a kind of spontaneity, which we tend to believe, well, he one day stood up and he sang a poem. No, years and years have gone into that singing of one or two lines. I think it is all labor, it's all hard work. Yes, some people are able to do it better than others.
But sir, Indian scriptures में भी तो बात होती है extraordinary perception की, that an artist is gifted with extraordinary perception. I mean, as somebody who's learned Western literature, there's also Coleridge who talks about an extraordinary consciousness, but not going to Coleridge. I think even in Indian scriptures, they talk about the writer's ability is significantly different from the ability of the common. But yeah, it's an endless discussion.
You see, no, I haven't found, see, out of like in my reading, I have not found any serious thinker or critic or theorist of poetry who says that, well, it just happens. They all talk about all this as a work of art of yourself. See the kind of arts of fashioning the self that Foucault talks about. You prepare yourself as an artist, and then intuition happens, which means you create the ground for intuition. I mean, I just cannot sit down one day and say, well, I am writing an epic. Maybe some miracles happen somewhere, but I am not a believer in those miracles. And I don't find any evidence supporting this idea of intuition or pratibha as far as my reading of the Indian tradition goes. It's a very rational tradition, substantially. At least that is the part I would love to embrace.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for saying it is not fragmentary. So you could catch that overall pattern. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, please.
Yes, are you audible?
Okay, sir. So I have a question. You said about Bhartrihari that language pre-exists for the child, as I understood it. So I want to know that in what sense or in what manner this language pre-exists. Does it exist in the collective consciousness in culture, or it is existing in a way for the individual as an infant as well?
You see, I don't think Bhartrihari talks about collective consciousness at all.
Okay.
Right. That would be like throwing back a relatively modern idea to those old times. But he does very clearly say, and there is a wonderful essay also in, I think, the Oxford Handbook of Indian Philosophy, dedicated to one aspect of linguistics in Bhartrihari, where this question is one of the questions addressed by the scholar. I don't recall the name of the scholar. A certain kind of something that we can call, as I said, proto-language does exist in us.
Since birth.
You see, if you're aware of that work of Antonio Damasio, that Italian thinker, who all his life has tried to study how feeling, thinking go together, and how actually the Cartesian division is a fraud actually committed on the people.
Yeah,
because Aristotle's old legacy was interrupted and disowned by people who believed in Descartes and followed him. This was never the case. Before you think, you have a certain feeling, and the real motivation, I think his latest book is The Strange Order of Things. The real motivation is feeling. You feel like, you look at something, you feel it, and then the rest begins. Thinking, etc. follow later. Now, what does it say? That I am yet to understand how me as a human being actually operates. Right? So, language is not something you pick up one day, because see, there are holes and holes in the arguments of Lacan and Saussure. What about the like mirror stage for the blind people? People who are born blind. Do you think they never enter the imaginary and they never have the symbolic? Right. So theories remain theories. And if you find some kind of counter to them, I think the counter opens up the possibility of re-examining the theories we have treated as truths. So proto-language is a certain kind of underlying system on which we will build, against it or strengthening it, a whole system of language.
So then it's kind of potential.
Pardon?
So it's potential of language.
Yes, and potential, but very much kind of inscribed in your consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
And you are saying it is in terms of feelings.
see, I am not a student of philosophy. No, no, no. I was giving an example of the complexity of the relationship between the body, emotion, intellect. They are a kind of integral whole. They are not like three separate things, right? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Rajesh, just one observation.
Yes, please.
It's quite very interesting. I mean, your title of your presentation was "The Past is Not Another Country: Recognizing and Remapping the Present Through Signs from Other Times."
Yeah.
So, I think that in this very research refresher course, we are rediscovering, or I should say, discovering this aspect of looking at the cultural philosophy and trying to see culture, and culture constitute language also, or language constitute culture,
Right.
and how from the Indian tradition you are bringing in the concepts which has been used in the writings in different times, and about pedagogy, about education, and the interpretation. My just I think my query is how you see Vyakhya and Vivechana, how you see this, the concept of Vyakhya and Vivechana in the in the sense when we are reinterpreting, or we are interpreting the our own terms. मतलब जिस भाषा में भारतीय दर्शन को जब पढ़ते हैं, या भारतीय भाषा के इतिहास को जो पढ़ते हैं, और उसमें जो जो साहित्य लिखा गया है, और आप 11वीं शताब्दी तक पहुंचते हैं, आप कश्मीर के शैविज्म से जो विचार हैं, मतलब एक अध्ययन के उसको सामने लेकर आते हैं। तो मतलब जो अलग अलग यात्राओं में मतलब दार्शनिकों ने, या मतलब जिन्होंने साहित्य की एक रचना की अपने अनुभवों के आधार पर, वो जिस भाषा में लिखे गए हैं, तो उस मतलब भारतीय भाषाओं में जिन शब्दों का इस्तेमाल किया गया है, उनकी व्याख्या और विवेचना, मतलब ये इन दोनों चीजों को आप कैसे देखते हैं? बहुत खूबसूरत था, मतलब मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा कि मतलब हम एक तरीके से ज्यादातर कई बार वेस्ट की तरफ हम समझने की कोशिश करते हैं, लेकिन खास तौर से जो संधि और जो तीर्थ की जो व्याख्या आपने रखी यहाँ पर, वो बहुत कलात्मक है। धन्यवाद राजेश जी।
Thank you. Thank you, Ambuji. You see, I don't believe in any cultural limits and cultural historical maps, personally. I think that ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Mesopotamia are as much my home as like present day India is. So that what at the present moment and in my present place and at my present stage I can relate to, and what meaning it gives to me to render my capacity to make my life meaningful is the only thing that matters. So I don't go into those kinds of philological things or those hermeneutical exercises in which we try to argue. And see, there are scholars who will do this, and they are right in doing this. But my personal approach is that if it touches me personally, it is important. If it does not, it may be of scholarly interest, but it is not something that matters to me as a question of life. Right. So when I interpret something, it is like, what meaning do I make of it? You can say that I remain at the level of that survival instinct, the basic survival instinct, where something is of use to me, I'll pick it up. If it is not, I'll leave it. But like how the Greeks read something, or how the Kashmiris in the, let's say, 2000 years ago or 800 years ago read it, I don't know. But how I would read it and find it strengthening my capabilities of living my life and doing my work better is the only thing that matters to me. So, as I said, my view is basically very modest, and it is a layperson's approach. It is not a scholar's or a professor's approach. It is a reader's approach. And I love that.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, yes.
Yes, anybody else? If anybody has the query.
Rajesh sir, thank you so much for the talk. And you have used three terms to engage with something called human, being human. You have used Adi Bhautik, Adi Devik, and Adhyatmik. Sir, I can understand easily the two terms, what to say, Adi Bhautik and Adhyatmik. But somehow, do you think is it necessary for one to conceive something supernatural? I mean, like my question is, what is your idea of supernatural? I can understand the first and the third one, but I fail to make sense of the second one. Supernatural. Why it is necessary to conceive something supernatural for being human? Thank you, sir.
Pointed out to a similar thing. No. She was, yeah. Shelley had pointed out to like those possibilities of miraculous inspirations or points of origin. Right. See, I don't agree that the supernatural is a necessary dimension of existence as we see the like human existence today. But why even Adhidevik or supernatural is of interest is intellectually and politically and ethically. It at least allows me to keep a window open to the possibility of something radically different, something that I don't want to believe in, I do not believe in. But what is the harm in my believing that what if something entirely different also exists? See, this is what I found very interesting in the recent book I read. Alan Jacobs has written a book on breaking bread with the dead. It's a lovely book. He says you go back to a book from the past, not in order to appropriate the book for the present, you go back to that book also to, while see, this project is not rejected, also to see how they thought. So if you read somebody who was an anti-feminist, who was a rabid patriarch, listen to that person. You may not agree, but what is the harm in listening? Right. So the supernatural allows me one that freedom of poetic invention that you find in myth. And what is myth? My belief is that myth is a way of finding the possibilities of historical patterns. History may apparently happen only once, but myth is something that indicates the possibilities of things happening again and again and again. So that is why the poet is the producer of myths. He is the producer of a kind of meta history and an underlying proto history. Right. This is how the supernatural comes in as part of an intellectual project. It doesn't agree with rationalism, but then rationalism has its own myths. Why not? How can I draw those limits of reason? On what basis do I do it? Because I believe in it. This is a myth. Whereas now we know, I mentioned Damasio's work, he says that your earliest feelings and ideas begin as at the level of bacteria. What if my greatest ideas have an origin in my cells? We are trying to establish that. So until we have established, we cannot simply like treat reason as everything or a certain rationality as everything. So the supernatural allows me the freedom to engage with the yet unthought, the yet unthinkable. That is why I respect it. I don't believe in it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I am so rich today with so many queries and so humbled that I must not have made very good sense. That is why so many questions came also. Wonderful. I'm so grateful to everybody who has asked me question. Yes, please.
Okay, sir. Sir, Shelly ma'am, shall I deliver my vote of
Yes,
thanks?
yes, please do, sir. Please do.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Yesh Kumar Sharma, sir, for this intellectual feast and for enlightening all the participants. Really, it was an enriching experience. You laid emphasis on the topics like Adhyan, Bodh, Acharan, Charan, Pratibha, Bhavak, Buddhi, Panini's Vyakaran, Antargya, Asan, Shraddha, Abhyas, Virgya, Samadhi, Sandhi, and Dharma. Really, sir, I am very thankful to you. It's a wonderful lecture. For Dr. Jesh Kumar Sharma, I would like to say some people extend beyond human limits and live not for the present but for the coming generations. I express my thankfulness to Dr. Jesh Kumar Sharma for accepting our request and delivering a scintillating lecture. We shall like to meet you more often and would love to listen to your valuable views. I'm also grateful to the Honorary Director HRDC Professor S.K. Tomar, Deputy Director JLP Datta ma'am, and special thanks to the course coordinator Dr. Pankaj Srivastava sir, who have toiled hard and burned the midnight oil and very conscientiously and meticulously organized this refresher course India Studies. Thank you, sir, for all the painstaking efforts you have put in organizing this event and turning this course into a mega show. I'm thankful to you, sir, for providing us this platform and opportunity for the intellectual interaction and self involvement and sensitizing the self. एक शेयर है जो मैं आपको एक आज अर्ज करना चाहता हूँ. I will just take 2 minutes. ये गजल है बाय राहत इंदौरी. खाक से बढ़कर कोई दौलत नहीं होती, छोटी मोटी बात पे हिजरत नहीं होती. पहले दीप जले तो चर्चे होते थे, अब शहर जले तो हैरत नहीं होती. कोई और उठा रखता है छत का बोझ, दीवारों में इतनी ताकत नहीं होती. सोच रहा हूं आखिर कब तक जीना है, मर जाता तो इतनी फुर्सत नहीं होती. रोटी की गुलाई नापा करता है, इसलिए तेरे घर में बरकत नहीं होती. हमने ही कुछ लिखना पढ़ना छोड़ दिया, वरना गजल की इतनी किल्लत नहीं होती. बाजारों में ढूंढ रहा हूं वो चीजें जिन चीजों की कोई कीमत नहीं होती. कोई क्या दे रहा है हमारे बारे में, ऐसे वैसों की तो हिम्मत नहीं होती. थैंक यू सो मच सर.
Thank you very much. My
For being
gratitude
here.
to everybody, organizers, Dr. Pankaj Srivastav, Dr. Rajesh Aswal, and Manvinder Singh Anand, all questioners and all participants. I'm so grateful for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much. All the best. And my open invitation to everybody to visit Patiala and join me anytime you wish to.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you, sir.
sir, for
Thank you,
what
sir.
invitation. Thank you so much.
Okay, sir, we will meet after the lunch at
Yeah,
2:30 p.m.
we will be
Uh,
meeting after lunch. Okay.
yeah.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manvinder.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Please.
Hello, Pankaj bhai.